Rand Paul, who sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, thanks so much for joining me. A U.S. official tells CNN that these strikes did not aim to kill ISIS targets, but rather other opponents of Bashar al-Assad. At this hour, there are unconfirmed reports of civilian casualties. If you were president right now, what would you do?
You know, I think the most important thing is to have open lines of communication. We had this during the debate that CNN hosted, where we discussed, should we be talking to Putin? Absolutely, we should have open lines of communication, because the most important thing not to have happen is to have an accident happen where one side or another shoots down one of the opposition's fighter jets. So it's a very messy situation. You know, the question is, are they killing ISIS or al-Nusra? Well, you know, sometimes it's difficult to tell which jihadist group you're killing over there. There are 1,500 different groups pledging allegiance to a variety of masters in that war, and it's very, very messy and difficult to determine who is whom.
What about the idea that they might be, since they're targeting homes, they might be targeting the so-called Syrian moderates and relatives of those individuals?
It's hard to determine who is moderate and who is not moderate. You know, we spent $500 million training about 60 Syrian moderates. They were captured in the first 10 minutes. They went back in. So I'm not sure if there really is a Syrian moderate force left over there. But I do think that it is very confusing in the sense that al-Nusra is an offshoot, basically, of al-Qaeda. It is a radical jihadist group. They are allied with al-Qaeda, as once was ISIS. There are no real pro-American groups over there, to my knowledge. There are no pro-Israel groups over there. So really, it's a very, very messy situation with people on both sides of that civil war who are not necessarily our friends.
A few days ago, the Obama administration's point man in the coalition against ISIS, retired Marine General John Allen, told me that he was worried that this increased Russian military presence could mean a confrontation with the coalition. If a Russian airstrike were to kill an American in this conflict, how would you as president respond? What would you do?
Well, I don't think it's really a good idea to talk about hypotheticals with Russians killing Americans. And the first thing I would do is try very strenuously for it not to happen. And the best way for it not to happen is to have open lines of communication so we know where fighter jets are flying on both sides of this. But I think the other historical point of view that we need to understand and be very certain of is that Russia's influence in this area has become greater since Saddam Hussein was toppled. So the Iraq War has actually led to a chaotic situation in which Iraq is now closely aligned with Iran. Iran is stronger and more emboldened because Hussein is gone. And now you have basically Iran, Iraq, and Syria all aligned with Russia. I think that's a situation that is actually worse than it was before the Iraq War.
Do you think that when it comes to what's going on in Syria, the United States should recognize that ISIS is the bigger threat and resign itself to Assad being in control of that country?
I don't know if I can give you an absolute conclusion, but what I would say is there have been times in our history when we have allied with people who are less than savory in order to get someone we think is a worse or a worse evil. I think really the first thing to understand is there may be no good guys in this war. You have ISIS on one side and Assad on the other side. And really part of the problem is ourselves, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar poured millions of tons of weapons into that civil war, but that pushed Assad back and allowed ISIS to grow. And remember, only a year or two ago, President Obama, Hillary Clinton, and many Republicans wanted to bomb Assad. I think had we done that, ISIS may well now be in control of all of Syria. So really, I think we have to think before we act and understand that intervention doesn't always achieve the intended consequences.
Assad, of course, has been responsible for massacring his own people. Does the United States have an interest in stopping that from happening? We're seeing the results of Assad still being in power spilling out into Europe with this refugee crisis.
You're absolutely right. It's absolutely a disaster over there. And I've told people somewhat flippantly, but trying to get a point across, if I were to see Assad walking down the street, I wouldn't feed him. I mean, he is an evil man who has gassed his people and is at least partly, if not mostly, responsible for this. But the war has two sides. And there are 2 million Christians in Syria. There are more Christians in Syria than any other country in the Middle East other than Egypt. And you ask every one of those Christians, you know what they say? Who would you prefer, Assad or ISIS? They all prefer Assad. So sometimes we don't quite understand the situation as well as people who live there. We also shouldn't be making decisions that indicate that we know with absolute certainty which is the best side to support. We could use our influence in the region to discourage Saudi Arabia from giving arms to ISIS, to discourage Qatar from giving arms to al-Nusra and radical al-Qaeda. But we also have we have American former generals like Petraeus saying we need to ally with al-Qaeda against ISIS. That's part of the problem, is the thinking that we can ally with people who hate us to go for people they hate even more. I think it's a mistake to be in the middle of that civil war. Now we have to deal with the consequences of it, but we need to learn from this action that toppling secular dictators doesn't make us less safe, and in fact has made the world more chaotic over there and really made it a much more dangerous world.
I think Petraeus was saying not al-Qaeda, but jihadists that might have joined with the jihad, but were convertible. But I take your point. I just wanted to clarify what Petraeus said. Senator Rand Paul, thank you so much. Appreciate your time, sir.